11:17 a.m. The air in the plant is thick with anticipation. Elite engineers stand in a silent circle around their latest multi-million-dollar prototype. The CEO, a woman of sharp intellect, steps forward. She traces the complex cooling layout with her finger. Suddenly she stops. Her eyes narrow as she spots an unconventional modification. She looks up and asks one freezing question. Who designed this cooling layout? Total silence falls. No one answers. Then from a small bench, an 8-year-old girl looks up from her homework. She points toward a man in oil-stained overalls scrubbing a wrench. My dad did. Every head turns at once. Elias is a man of grit, gears, and quiet resilience. At 40 years old, his life is a testament to the beauty of the mundane. 6 years ago, the world lost its color when his wife passed away, leaving him to raise their daughter, Maya, alone. Since that day, Elias has found solace in two things: the unwavering love for his child and the mechanical heartbeat of the engines he maintains. He is not a design engineer with a fancy degree from a top-tier university. He doesn't sit in glass-walled offices drinking espresso while sketching on a tablet. Elias is a lead mechanic on the assembly floor. He is the man who speaks the language of the machines. He knows when a piston is slightly misaligned by the pitch of its hum. He knows when a gasket is about to fail by the way the heat radiates off the casing. He has over 18 years of hands-on experience, and in his world, experience is the only currency that matters. His daily routine is a rhythmic dance of steel and sweat. He arrives before the sun fully claims the sky, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the heat that will soon rise from the shop floor. He walks through the rows of sleeping giants, massive blocks of iron and aluminum, waiting for his touch to bring them to life. For Elias, these aren't just objects of commerce. They are intricate puzzles that demand respect. He spends his mornings diagnosing the aches and pains of machines that have worked too hard, his ears tuned to frequencies that others dismiss as background noise. He can tell if a bearing is scored simply by the vibration of the floorboards beneath his boots. It is a level of intimacy with the physical world that no computer simulation can replicate. The weight of responsibility sits heavy but comfortable on his shoulders. Every nut tightened and every bolt torqued is a silent promise to his late wife that he will provide a stable life for Maya. He doesn't mind the grease that permanently stains his cuticles or the ache in his lower back at the end of a 12-hour shift. To him, the metallic scent of the factory is the smell of progress, of a life being rebuilt one gear at a time. He finds a strange poetry in the way a well-oiled machine operates, seeing it as a reflection of the order he tries to maintain in his own quiet home. Every afternoon after school, the corner of the workshop becomes Maya's sanctuary. She sits on a small, worn-out stool surrounded by the rhythmic clanking of hammers and the hiss of pneumatic drills. To her, the factory isn't a loud, dirty place. It is a playground of wonders where her father is a king. She watches him work with a mix of awe and curiosity. She watches his calloused hands move with the precision of a surgeon, handling heavy steel parts as if they were fragile glass. Maya doesn't just do her homework there. She studies her father. She learns the value of hard work and the importance of paying attention to the details that everyone else ignores. She is the shadow that follows him through the grease and the smoke, always ready with a question that makes Elias smile. One afternoon, while Elias was deep inside the guts of a massive turbine, Maya looked up from her science book. "Dad," she asked, her voice small but clear over the drone of the machinery, "how do engines breathe?" Elias stopped what he was doing and wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of black oil on his forehead. He didn't give her a lecture on internal combustion or air intake ratios. He knelt down so he was at her eye level and pointed to the massive air filters. "They breathe through air and patience, Maya," he said with a soft chuckle. "Just like us. If they get too much at once, they choke. If they don't get enough, they starve. You have to listen to what the machine is telling you. If you're patient enough, it will tell you exactly what it needs to stay alive. A happy engine sounds like a cat purring, not a dog barking. Your job is to make sure it keeps purring." The company Elias works for is currently in the middle of a high-stakes evolution. They are developing a new generation of high-efficiency engines intended for heavy industrial use. The project is the backbone of the firm's future, but it has hit a significant wall. The previous iterations of the prototype had a fatal flaw. They were powerful, yes, but they were also prone to overheating during long-duration runs. The cooling systems were designed by the best theoretical minds in the country using advanced thermal modeling. Yet on the test bench, the engines would glow cherry red and eventually seize up, the metal protesting against its own design. The engineers were frustrated, staring at their computer models and simulations, trying to figure out why the reality on the factory floor didn't match the math on their screens. They were looking for a complex solution, new alloys, exotic coolants, or liquid nitrogen injectors, completely missing the simple truth that was staring them in the face. Months ago, during a routine maintenance check on one of the failed prototypes, Elias had noticed something. He wasn't looking at a screen. He was looking at the way the coolant stains formed on the metal, tracing the paths where the liquid stagnated and boiled. He was feeling the way the vibration changed when the temperature spiked, a frantic shudder that told him the metal was expanding too quickly. During a break, he had approached a group of young engineers who were debating the thermal dynamics of the engine. He stood there, a humble mechanic in grease-stained clothes, and waited for a gap in their conversation. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I've been looking at the flow. I think if you change the direction of the cooling lines and move the intake slightly, the air would swirl differently. It might keep the core temperature down. It's like a river. If the water hits a sharp corner, it just eddies and gets hot." The response was predictable. One of the junior engineers, a young man with a crisp white shirt and a badge that said Design Lead, barely looked up from his tablet. "Thanks for the input, Elias, but we've run thousands of simulations on this. The current layout is optimized for maximum surface area contact according to the latest Reynolds number calculations. It's a matter of fluid dynamics, not just moving pipes around. We appreciate your diligence, but the math is settled." The other engineers nodded in agreement, their eyes returning to their digital models. Elias wasn't offended. He had spent his life being the man who fixed things, not the man who thought of them. He nodded, turned around, and went back to his wrench. He knew they wouldn't listen. In their world, a mechanic's intuition couldn't compete with a supercomputer's data. But Elias couldn't let it go. It was like a puzzle that kept him awake at night, the heat patterns dancing in his mind whenever he closed his eyes. One evening, while he was working late to repair a test rig that had overheated and stalled, he decided to try something. He wasn't supposed to change the design, but he knew the rig was destined for the scrap heap anyway. He spent hours rerouting the copper cooling tubes, bending them with a rhythmic grace that came from years of muscle memory. He used a blowtorch to reshape a few connectors, creating a spiral flow that moved the coolant in a way the original blueprints never intended. He adjusted the air intake, creating a vortex effect that pulled heat away from the most vulnerable parts of the engine. He felt like a rebel in his own workshop, the blue flame of the torch reflecting in his safety goggles. Every weld he made felt like a defiance of the math that had failed so many times. He was translating years of observing failures into a physical solution. He didn't have a CAD model, but he had the sensory memory of every engine he'd ever touched that had died of thirst. He stayed until 3 a.m, his hands shaking from fatigue, but his heart racing with a strange certainty. He cleaned the area meticulously, leaving no trace of his midnight experiment other than the redesigned veins of the machine. The next morning, a young engineer named Leo arrived early to run one last test on that specific rig before it was decommissioned. He expected the usual failure: the smoke, the warning lights, the smell of burning oil. To his absolute shock, the engine didn't just run, it thrived. The temperature gauges stayed in the green for hours, even at full throttle. The efficiency was higher than anything they had achieved in the lab. Leo was stunned. He crawled under the rig with a flashlight and realized it had been modified. He didn't see a thuggish hack. He saw a stroke of pure, practical genius. He took out his notebook and began to sketch the new layout, realizing that the spiral flow eliminated the dead zones where heat used to gather. He didn't know who had done it, and he was too afraid to ask, fearing someone would get in trouble for tampering with the prototype. Instead, he quietly incorporated the changes into the final design for the official prototype, labeling it as a structural optimization to avoid questions. The day of the big reveal finally arrived. The board of directors, the investors, and the CEO were all present. The atmosphere was electric. The smell of fresh paint and expensive perfume mixing with the industrial sense of the factory. The new prototype sat in the center of the workshop, looking like a masterpiece of modern engineering. It was sleek, powerful, and for the first time, it promised to be reliable. The engineers were beaming, taking credit for the breakthrough that had saved the project and their bonuses. But the CEO, Ms. Sterling, was not easily impressed by smiles and handshakes. She was a woman who understood that success is built on the details. She walked around the engine, her sharp eyes scanning every bolt and every connection, looking for the flaw she was sure was still there. She saw the cooling layout, and her intuition told her this wasn't the product of a computer simulation. It was too organic, it was too clever. It looked like something that had grown, not something that had been programmed. Ms. Sterling stood at the center of the group, her presence commanding absolute attention. The humming of the factory seemed to dim as she spoke. "This cooling system," she began, her voice echoing off the metal rafters, "it is the most innovative part of this entire engine. It's elegant, it's efficient, and it completely defies our traditional models. I want to know who suggested this specific change. I want to meet the mind behind this spiraling vortex design. I want to know the logic that overrode our six-figure software." The lead engineers looked at one another, their faces flushing with a mix of confusion and hesitation. No one wanted to admit they didn't know. The project manager cleared his throat, looking for an excuse. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable. Leo, the young engineer who had copied the design, looked down at his shoes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say a word, a small voice rang out from the back of the room. "My dad did." The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Everyone turned to see Maya sitting on her bench, her finger pointing directly at Elias. Elias was at his workstation, halfway through cleaning a heavy-duty pump, his hands covered in a fresh layer of charcoal-colored grease. He froze, the rag in his hand suspended in midair. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards, or perhaps just crawl inside a nearby turbine. The CEO turned her gaze from the little girl to the man in the greasy overalls. "Elias?" Missy Sterling asked, her eyebrows arching in surprise. "You designed this layout?" Elias slowly put down his wrench and wiped his hands on his pants, though the oil was so deep it barely moved. He walked toward the center of the room, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, some judgmental, some stunned, some hopeful. He looked at his daughter, who gave him a proud, encouraging nod, her small face glowing with a certainty that only a child can have. "It wasn't exactly a design, ma'am," Elias said, his voice steady but humble. "It was just something I noticed while I was fixing the prototype a few months back. I saw where the heat was trapped. It was pooling right behind the third cylinder. I thought the air needed to move differently. I just adjusted the pipes to help the engine breathe better. I didn't mean to interfere with the official plans. I just wanted it to work." The room was so quiet you could hear the distant drip of a leaky faucet. The elite engineers were staring at Elias as if he had just claimed to have invented fire. They couldn't believe it. This man who spent his days covered in dirt and oil had solved the problem that had stumped their best computers. One of the senior designers stepped forward, his face red with indignation. "This is ridiculous. He's a mechanic, not a physicist. There's no way he understood the thermal gradients. He doesn't even know the first law of thermodynamics." Miss Sterling held up a hand, silencing him instantly. She didn't look angry. She looked fascinated. She walked over to the prototype and then back to Elias. She realized that while her engineers were looking at the engine as a series of equations, Elias was looking at it as a living, breathing entity. He had the one thing that no degree could provide, the wisdom of the hands. In that moment, an emotional peak hit the room. It wasn't just about an engine anymore. It was about the invisible walls we build between thinkers and doers. It was about the way we overlook the people who actually make our world function while chasing the prestige of titles and diplomas. Ms. Sterling looked at the lead engineers, then back at Elias. She saw the grease under his fingernails and the intelligence in his eyes. She saw a man who had been ignored for decades despite holding the keys to their success. She understood that the most valuable asset in her entire company wasn't sitting in a boardroom. He was standing in front of her in a tattered work shirt. She realized that the breakthrough they had been praying for had come from the person they had listened to the least. Ms. Sterling took a step closer to Elias, her expression softening. "How did you think of it, Elias?" "Our simulations showed that the spiral flow would be less efficient due to friction loss. Why did you think it would work?" Elias took a breath, looking at the machine he had spent his life understanding. "Because I'm the one who fixes them when they overheat, ma'am. I've seen where the metal warps. I've felt the vibration of a core that's struggling to stay cool. The computer sees the friction, but it doesn't see the way the heat clings to the corners. It's like cleaning a room. If you just blow air in a straight line, the dust stays in the corners. You have to swirl it to get it out. I just gave the heat a path to escape. I wasn't thinking about the math. I was thinking about the machine's comfort. If the machine is happy, it will work for you." Ms. Sterling nodded slowly, a small smile appearing on her face. She turned to the lead engineers. "From now on, I want every design validated by the people who have to maintain it. If a mechanic says a pipe shouldn't be there, we listen. If they say the airflow is wrong, we test it. No more ivory tower engineering. We have been arrogant, thinking that a degree is the only measure of intelligence. Elias has proven that observation is the greatest teacher of all." The room erupted into a low murmur of shock and excitement. Elias felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Leo, the young engineer. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner, Elias. I saw what you did on that rig. It was brilliant. I was just too afraid to admit that a mechanic knew more than I did." Elias offered a small smile. "We all have things to learn, son. I just have a head start on the dirt." That evening, the factory was quiet. The crowds had left and the prototype was locked away. Elias was finishing up his final task for the day, with Maya helping him rinse his hands at the heavy iron sink. The soap was industrial strength, designed to cut through the thickest grime. Maya scrubbed his knuckles with a small brush, her face serious. "Dad," she asked, looking up at him, "are engineers smarter than mechanics?" Elias paused, the water splashing over his hands, washing away the evidence of his labor. He looked at the reflection of the workshop lights in the puddles on the floor. "No, Maya," he said gently. "They just see different parts of the same machine. An engineer sees what the engine could be, the potential, the dream. A mechanic sees what the engine actually is, the reality, the struggle. You need both to make something that truly works. One dreams it, and the other keeps it alive. Don't ever let someone tell you that because your hands are dirty, your mind isn't clean." The impact of that day was immediate and profound. Ms. Sterling didn't just give Elias a bonus. She changed the way the entire company operated. She realized that the gap between the design office and the assembly floor was a canyon that needed to be bridged. She issued a new directive. From that day forward, the mechanics would be involved in the design phase of every project. They would be the reality check for the theoretical models. They would be the voice of the machine during the sketching process. It was a revolutionary move in the industry, one that valued practical wisdom as much as academic excellence. Other companies scoffed at first, but when the reliability of Stirling engines doubled within a year, they began to pay attention. The mini climax of this shift happened a few weeks later during the first joint brainstorming session. Elias was sitting at a large mahogany table, surrounded by engineers who had previously ignored him. At first, the atmosphere was tense. The engineers were protective of their territory, and Elias felt out of place in the clean, quiet room. But as they began to discuss a new fuel injection system, Elias spoke up. He didn't use technical jargon. He talked about the way the fuel would pool in the cold startup. He talked about the way the spray pattern would affect the valve life based on the residue he had seen in hundreds of engines. One by one, the engineers leaned in. They started asking him questions. They started sketching based on his descriptions. The wall had finally come down, replaced by a bridge of mutual respect. A month later, the first production-ready version of the engine was undergoing its final endurance test. It was a grueling 48-hour run at maximum capacity designed to break any weak link. The entire staff gathered in the control room, watching the monitors. The temperature was perfectly stable, a flat line that made the engineers sigh with relief. The efficiency was record-breaking. It was the most successful launch in the company's history. When the test ended, a cheer went up that shook the windows. People were hugging and high-fiving. But Elias wasn't in the control room. He was out on the floor doing what he always did, making sure the next machine was ready to go, his hands already back in the grease. Mrs. Sterling walked through the factory, the sounds of celebration echoing behind her. She spotted Maya sitting in her usual corner, reading a book about aerospace engineering. Mrs. Sterling sat down on the bench beside her. "Do you like engines, Maya?" she asked with a smile. Maya nodded, her eyes bright with a sense of belonging. "I like making things work," she replied. "My dad says that anyone can build a machine, but only someone who loves it can make it work. My dad makes them work. He says the machine is like a person. It needs to be understood, not just used. He listens to them like they're telling him secrets." Ms. Sterling looked at the little girl and saw the future. She saw a generation that wouldn't see a divide between the mind and the hand, between the designer and the maker. The final scene of the day was a quiet one. Elias was at his bench, his back to the room, focused on a delicate assembly. He didn't have a new title on his badge. He didn't have a corner office. He was still the man in the overalls. But as he worked, a senior design engineer walked up to him. The engineer didn't have a tablet or a list of instructions. He had a blueprint and a question. "Elias, we're looking at the pressure ratios for the new turbine. Based on what you've seen on the test rigs, do you think this seal will hold, or should we rethink the material? We want to get it right the first time." Elias wiped his hands, took a look at the drawing, and began to explain. The CEO had searched for the designer of the most innovative cooling system she had ever seen. She had expected to find a world-famous engineer with a wall full of awards and a shelf of textbooks. Instead, a little girl had shown her the truth. She had found a father who worked in the shadows, a man who didn't care about credit or fame, only about the integrity of his work. She had found the soul of the machine. The story of the engine wasn't a story of technology. It was a story of respect and the recognition of talent in every form. It was a reminder that sometimes the best ideas don't come from the people who study the machines in books. They come from the people who fix the machines every single day, the ones who listen to the heartbeat of the iron and know exactly what it needs to breathe. As the sun set over the factory, casting long shadows across the heavy machinery, Elias and Maya walked to their old car. The day was done, and the world was a little better because a humble man had been heard. Elias ruffled Maya's hair, and she took his hand, her small fingers interlocking with his calloused ones. They were just a father and a daughter, but in that factory, they had become a legend, a reminder that expertise has many faces. The machines were humming in the dark, a steady, peaceful sound that promised a future where every voice mattered. Elias drove home, a quiet man in a world that finally understood the value of a steady hand, a patient heart, and the profound wisdom that lives beneath a layer of grease. If this story of hidden wisdom and the power of practical experience moved you, please support us. Like this video and subscribe to the High TL Stories channel. We bring you daily stories of people who prove that greatness can be found in the most unexpected places. Thank you for being a part of our community and for listening to the voices that often go unheard.